You've felt it before, that sinking sensation when you realize you're pouring your heart and soul into someone who will never change, never grow, never reciprocate the emotional investment you're making in their life. You stay up late worrying about them. You cancel your own plans to be available when they call in crisis. You offer advice that falls on deaf ears, and you watch them make the same destructive choices over and over again, while your own mental health deteriorates from the constant stress of trying to fix what cannot be fixed. The exhaustion runs deeper than physical tiredness. It's a bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting a battle you can never win. From giving pieces of yourself to people who consume your energy without ever offering anything meaningful in return. You start to question your own judgment, wondering if you're being too harsh, if you should try harder, if there's something more you could do, and the guilt of even considering stepping back feels almost unbearable because you've been conditioned to believe that caring means never giving up, that love means endless sacrifice, that being a good person requires you to save everyone who crosses you. Path. Jean Piaget, the revolutionary Swiss psychologist who spent over 60 years studying human cognitive development, made a discovery that most people find uncomfortable but absolutely essential to understand if you want to preserve your sanity and build healthy relationships. Through his meticulous observations of children and adults, Piaget identified specific cognitive patterns that determine whether someone is capable of growth, change, and genuine reciprocal connection. And his findings reveal why some people will drain your energy indefinitely, while others will flourish with your support. What Piaget discovered wasn't just about children learning to think differently as they mature. It was about fundamental structures of cognition that either allow for adaptation and growth or lock people into rigid patterns that resist all external influence. These patterns persist into adulthood and create what Piaget called cognitive rigidity, a state where the mind becomes incapable of accommodating new information that challenges existing beliefs or behaviors. The most devastating part of Piaget's research is what he found about equilibration, the process by which healthy minds maintain balance between what they already know and new information they encounter. When equilibration is functioning properly, a person can experience disequilibrium, that uncomfortable feeling when reality doesn't match their expectations, and then adapt their thinking to accommodate this new reality. But Piaget identified specific types of people whose cognitive systems have become so rigid that they cannot achieve equilibration. Instead, they defend their existing schemas, their mental frameworks for understanding the world, with such intensity that they will distort reality rather than change their thinking. These individuals will rewrite history, blame others for their circumstances, create elaborate justifications for their behavior, and most importantly, they will use your desire to help them as a source of energy to maintain their dysfunction rather than as a catalyst for growth. In the quiet research rooms of the University of Geneva, where Piaget conducted thousands of hours of observations, he documented case after case of children who showed early signs of what would become lifelong patterns of cognitive inflexibility. One particular study involved a 7-year-old girl named Marie, whose responses to Piaget's conservation tasks revealed something alarming about her cognitive development. When Piaget poured the same amount of water from a short, wide glass into a tall, narrow glass, Marie insisted that the tall glass contained more water. But what made her case unique wasn't just her incorrect answer. It was her absolute refusal to consider any evidence to the contrary. Even when Piaget poured the water back and forth multiple times, even when he had her measure the water herself, Marie became increasingly agitated and began creating elaborate explanations for why the water was somehow multiplying and shrinking, rather than accepting that her initial perception was wrong. This wasn't simple childhood stubbornness. Piaget realized he was witnessing a fundamental failure in what he called accommodation. the cognitive process that allows us to modify our existing mental structures when we encounter information that doesn't fit our current understanding. Marie's mind had developed what Piaget would later term defensive schemas, mental frameworks designed not to understand reality, but to protect the ego from the discomfort of being wrong. As Piaget followed Marie's development over several years, he watched this pattern extend into every area of her life. She blamed her teachers when she struggled with schoolwork. She insisted that other children were lying when they disagreed with her version of events. And she developed an increasingly elaborate internal narrative where she was always the victim of circumstances beyond her control. Oh, what makes Piaget's research so relevant to your adult relationships is that these cognitive patterns don't disappear with age. They become more sophisticated and more deeply entrenched. The child who cannot accommodate new information becomes the adult who cannot take responsibility for their actions, who cannot learn from mistakes, who cannot see their role in relationship conflicts, and who will use every tool at their disposal, including your empathy and desire to help, to maintain their distorted view of reality. Piaget identified 6 distinct types of people whose cognitive development has become so arrested that attempting to save them will inevitably damage your own psychological well-being, not because they are bad people, but because their minds literally cannot process the type of feedback and reflection required for genuine change. The first type Piaget identified were what he called the concrete operational fixated, adults whose thinking remains locked in the concrete operational stage of development, typically reached around age 7, but meant to be transcended by adolescence. These individuals can only think in terms of concrete, immediate reality and cannot engage in abstract reasoning about their own behavior or its impact on others. When you try to help someone who is concrete operational fixated, you'll notice that they can discuss practical solutions to immediate problems, but become confused or angry when you try to explore patterns in their behavior or the underlying causes of their difficulties. They might say something like, "Just tell me what to do right now," and become frustrated when you suggest that understanding why they keep making the same mistakes might be important for long-term change. Sarah, a woman Piaget observed in his later clinical work, exemplified this pattern perfectly. At 35, she had been through multiple relationships that ended the same way, with her partner eventually becoming exhausted by her constant need for attention and validation. When friends tried to help Sarah understand that her jealousy and possessiveness were driving people away, she would focus only on immediate solutions, asking for scripts of what to say or specific rules to follow, but she could never engage with the deeper question of why she felt so insecure in relationships. Her thinking was entirely concrete. She could see that her boyfriend didn't text her back within an hour and conclude that he didn't love her, but she could not think abstractly about how her own anxiety might be influencing her interpretation of his behavior. Trying to save Sarah meant being trapped in an endless cycle of crisis management, where every day brought a new concrete problem that required immediate attention, but the underlying patterns never changed because her mind couldn't process abstract concepts like emotional regulation or attachment styles. People who are concrete operational fixated will exhaust you because they require constant external regulation of their emotional and behavioral responses. They cannot develop internal coping mechanisms because internal coping requires abstract thinking, the ability to step back from immediate circumstances and consider broader patterns, alternative perspectives, and long-term consequences. Instead, they rely on others to provide the cognitive functions their own minds cannot perform, turning every relationship into a caretaking dynamic where you become responsible for managing their emotional reactions to daily life. The second type Piaget identified were the egocentrically arrested, individuals whose development stopped at the pre-operational stage, where children naturally believe that everyone sees the world exactly as they do. In normal development, children outgrow this egocentrism around age 7, when they develop what Piaget called theory of mind, the understanding that other people have different thoughts, feelings, and perspectives. But some individuals never make this crucial developmental leap, and they remain fundamentally unable to imagine that other people might have valid experiences that differ from their own. Marcus represented a perfect example of egocentric arrest when Piaget encountered him during a study of adult conflict resolution. At 42, Marcus was convinced that his wife's depression was actually a deliberate attempt to manipulate him, because in his mind, sadness was something people chose to feel when they wanted attention. When Piaget asked Marcus to consider that his wife might genuinely be struggling with chemical imbalances and life circumstances that had nothing to do with him, Marcus became agitated and insisted that Piaget didn't understand the situation because he wasn't living with someone who turned on the tears whenever she wanted sympathy. Marcus literally could not conceive of a reality where his wife's emotional experience was separate from his own interpretation of her motives. When you try to save someone who is egocentrically arrested, you'll find yourself constantly explaining basic concepts about how other people think and feel, concepts that should be intuitive to any emotionally mature adult. They will interpret your emotions as being about them. They will assume that your reactions to their behavior are unreasonable because those reactions don't match what they would feel in your position, and they will become genuinely confused when you try to explain that your perspective might be different from theirs. The most exhausting part of these relationships is that egocentrically arrested individuals often seem to be listening to your explanations and even agreeing with them, but then they immediately revert to their original assumptions because they cannot actually hold multiple perspectives in their mind simultaneously. You might spend hours explaining to an egocentrically arrested person that their criticism feels hurtful to you, and they might even apologize and promise to be more careful with their words. But the next day, they'll make another cutting remark and be genuinely surprised that you're upset, because in their mind, they already addressed this issue yesterday, and your continued sensitivity doesn't make sense. They're not being deliberately cruel. Their cognitive development simply hasn't progressed to the point where they can maintain awareness of other people's emotional realities when those realities differ from their own immediate experience. Have you ever found yourself trying to explain to someone over and over again why their behavior hurts you, only to watch them look at you with genuine confusion, as if you're speaking a foreign language? Or maybe you've noticed that certain people in your life seem incapable of understanding that your reactions to their actions might be based on your own past experiences, your own emotional needs, your own way of processing the world. If this resonates with you, I know how isolating and crazy making that experience can be. You start to wonder if you're being too sensitive, if your feelings are valid, if there's something wrong with you for needing things that seem so obvious and basic. If this sounds familiar to you, leave a comment saying, "I thought it was just me." Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone in this struggle. You have more power to heal and validate others than you realize. The third type Piaget identified were the assimilation dominants, people whose cognitive systems have become so biased toward assimilation, the process of interpreting new information to fit existing beliefs, that they've essentially lost the ability to accommodate, to change their beliefs when confronted with contradictory evidence. In healthy cognitive development, assimilation and accommodation work together in a balanced dance. We interpret new experiences through the lens of what we already know, but we also modify our knowledge when reality proves our assumptions wrong. Assimilation dominants have lost this balance entirely. They force all new information into their existing mental frameworks, no matter how much distortion this requires. Jennifer, a case study from Piaget's research into adult learning difficulties, demonstrated this pattern in her approach to relationships. She had developed a core belief that people always leave when they get bored, based on early experiences with inconsistent caregivers. Every relationship Jennifer entered was interpreted through this lens. When partners needed space, she saw it as evidence that they were getting bored. When they had bad days and were less affectionate, she saw it as the beginning of the end. When they tried to address problems in the relationship, she heard confirmation that they were already mentally planning their exit. No amount of reassurance could reach Jennifer because her mind automatically converted every piece of contradictory evidence into support for her original belief. When Jennifer's boyfriend told her he loved her and wanted to work through their difficulties, she heard, "He's trying to let me down easy." When he suggested couples therapy, she heard, "He's building a case for why the breakup is my fault." When friends pointed out that his actions consistently demonstrated commitment and care, Jennifer would find ways to reinterpret those actions as manipulation or obligation. Her mind had become so skilled at assimilation that she could take any event, no matter how positive, and twist it to fit her narrative of inevitable abandonment. Trying to save someone who is assimilation dominant is like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Every piece of evidence you provide that contradicts their negative beliefs gets filtered through their existing schemas and transformed into evidence that supports those beliefs. They will take your patience as proof that you're planning to hurt them even more. When you finally leave, they will interpret your honesty about your own struggles as confirmation that they're too much trouble. They will see your efforts to help them grow as evidence that you find them inadequate as they are. The more you try to convince them that their fears are unfounded, the more convinced they become that you're either lying or deluded. The fourth type are what Piaget called the equilibration avoiders, individuals who have developed sophisticated psychological defenses specifically designed to prevent the discomfort of disequilibrium, that necessary state of cognitive tension that motivates growth and learning. These people have organized their entire lives around avoiding any situation that might challenge their existing beliefs or force them to question their behaviors. They surround themselves with people who enable their dysfunction. They avoid activities that might reveal their limitations, and they develop elaborate systems of blame and rationalization that protect them from having to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. Robert, whom Piaget studied during his research into adult defense mechanisms, had built an entire lifestyle around equilibration avoidance. At 50, Robert had never held a job for more than 18 months, but he had developed intricate explanations for each career failure that placed responsibility entirely on external factors. Bad bosses, unfair policies, office politics, economic downturns. Robert could explain away any professional setback without ever considering his own contribution to the pattern. When friends suggested that he might benefit from examining his approach to workplace relationships or his attitude toward authority, Robert would become defensive and eventually distance himself from anyone who challenged his narrative. What made Robert particularly skilled at equilibration avoidance was his ability to seek out people who would reinforce his victim narrative. He gravitated toward sympathetic listeners who would validate his complaints without asking difficult questions. And he had an intuitive sense for when someone was about to challenge his perspective, allowing him to end conversations or relationships before experiencing the discomfort of real self-reflection. Robert's mind had become so sensitive to potential disequilibrium that he could detect and neutralize challenges to his worldview before they reached conscious awareness. When you try to save an equilibration avoider, you'll notice that they seem to have an endless capacity for seeking support and advice, but they never implement suggestions that would require them to change their fundamental approach to life. They want you to fix their problems without them having to face any uncomfortable realities about their role in creating those problems. They will listen to your insights with apparent interest. They might even thank you for your wisdom, but somehow circumstances always prevent them from taking action, or they try your suggestions in such a half-hearted way that failure becomes inevitable and they can return to their familiar position of helpless victimhood. The fifth type Piaget identified were the schema rigidified, people whose mental frameworks have become so inflexible that they cannot adapt to changing circumstances, new information, or evolving relationships. Schemas, in Piaget's theory, are the mental structures we use to organize and interpret experience, and in healthy development, these schemas remain flexible enough to accommodate new learning throughout life. But schema-rigidified individuals have developed mental frameworks that function more like prisons than tools, trapping them in outdated ways of thinking and behaving that may have served them at one point, but now create problems in every area of their lives. Catherine, a subject in Piaget's longitudinal studies of adult adaptation, exemplified schema rigidification in her approach to parenting. She had developed a rigid schema that children need strict discipline to become responsible adults, based on her own upbringing in a military family. This schema worked adequately when her children were young and needed clear boundaries. But as they grew into teenagers with their own personalities and developmental needs, Catherine's inability to adapt her parenting approach created increasing conflict and distance in their relationships. When her teenage daughter began showing signs of depression, Catherine interpreted this as defiance that required stricter discipline. When her son started pulling away and spending more time with friends, she saw this as disrespect that needed to be corrected with additional rules and consequences. Family therapists, friends, and even her own children tried to help Catherine understand that her teenagers needed different types of support than younger children, that normal adolescent development involves questioning authority and developing independence, that her increasingly punitive approach was actually driving her children away rather than teaching them responsibility. But Catherine's schemas had become so rigid that she literally could not process information that contradicted her fundamental beliefs about child rearing. Instead of accommodating new information about adolescent development, she doubled down on her existing approach, convinced that everyone else simply didn't understand the importance of maintaining authority and structure. Schema, rigidified individuals will exhaust you because they approach every new situation with the same limited set of responses, regardless of whether those responses are appropriate or effective. They cannot learn from experience because learning requires the flexibility to modify existing schemas, and they cannot adapt to changing circumstances because adaptation requires the ability to develop new schemas when old ones become obsolete. When you try to help them, you'll find yourself repeatedly offering the same suggestions and watching them implement the same ineffective strategies, then expressing frustration that nothing works while remaining completely unable to consider alternative approaches. The sixth and most dangerous type Piaget identified were the parasitic assimilators, individuals who have learned to use other people's cognitive and emotional resources as a substitute for developing their own internal capacities. These people have discovered that they can maintain psychological stability by essentially outsourcing their emotional regulation, decision-making, and problem-solving to others, and they become masterful at identifying and exploiting people who are willing to provide these services. Unlike the other types who are limited by cognitive rigidity or developmental arrest, parasitic assimilators often possess sophisticated social intelligence that they use specifically to manipulate others into providing the mental and emotional functions they refuse to develop themselves. David, perhaps the most disturbing case in Piaget's research files, demonstrated how parasitic assimilation could destroy the psychological well-being of everyone in his orbit. Highly intelligent and emotionally perceptive, David had learned early in life that he could avoid the discomfort of developing his own coping mechanisms by becoming expert at triggering other people's caretaking instincts. He would create just enough crisis and vulnerability to activate others' desire to help, then gradually increase his demands until his supporters found themselves completely responsible for managing his emotional life. When one caretaker became exhausted and tried to establish boundaries, David would seamlessly transfer his dependence to someone new, often using the previous person's withdrawal as evidence of abandonment that justified his need for even more intensive support from the next victim. What made David particularly dangerous was his ability to frame his parasitic behavior as mutual intimacy and connection. He would tell his caretakers that they were the only person who truly understood him, that their support was healing years of trauma and abuse, that he was finally learning to trust again because of their patience and love. He created an illusion of reciprocity by offering emotional intensity and apparent vulnerability in exchange for practical support. But careful observation revealed that David's emotional sharing was carefully calculated to increase others' investment in his well-being rather than to create genuine intimacy. He would reveal just enough pain to trigger protective instincts, just enough progress to maintain hope, and just enough appreciation to make his supporters feel valued and needed. The devastating reality about parasitic assimilators is that they can maintain this pattern indefinitely because they are not actually trying to get better. They are trying to perfect their ability to extract resources from others without having to reciprocate or develop independence. Each relationship becomes a learning laboratory where they refine their techniques for identifying potential caretakers, activating their protective instincts, and maintaining their dependency without triggering abandonment. They study their supporters' vulnerabilities and needs, then provide just enough of what those people are seeking to keep them engaged in the caretaking dynamic. Piaget's research revealed that these 6 types of people share one crucial characteristic that makes them impossible to save. They have all developed cognitive systems that are organized around avoiding the fundamental discomfort that drives human growth and learning. Whether through rigidity, egocentrism, assimilation dominance, equilibration avoidance, schema inflexibility, or parasitic dependence, they have found ways to maintain psychological stability without having to face the challenging work of genuine development and change. This isn't a moral failing or a character defect. It's a cognitive structure that has become so entrenched that it functions automatically below the level of conscious awareness, determining how they process information, interpret relationships, and respond to challenges. The tragedy is that your desire to help these individuals actually enables them to maintain their dysfunctional patterns because it provides external sources of stability that eliminate their motivation to develop internal resources. When you provide emotional regulation for someone who refuses to learn self-soothing techniques, when you offer problem-solving support to someone who won't develop critical thinking skills, when you give endless patience to someone who exploits your empathy without reciprocating, you become part of the system that keeps them stuck in their arrested development. Your kindness, which would be healing and supportive to someone who is genuinely working toward growth, becomes a resource that allows them to avoid the very discomfort that would motivate real change. Piaget discovered that trying to force growth in these individuals not only fails to help them, but actually damages your own cognitive and emotional development because it requires you to abandon your own healthy patterns of thinking and relating. To maintain relationships with people who cannot accommodate new information, You have to suppress your own need for intellectual honesty and authentic communication. To continue supporting someone who cannot consider your perspective, you have to gradually diminish your own emotional needs and valid expectations. To keep investing in someone who uses your resources without reciprocating, you have to override your own instincts for balance and fairness in relationships. What Piaget found most disturbing was how good people with genuine empathy and healthy relationship skills, could be systematically trained to abandon their own well-being in service of someone else's dysfunction. The very qualities that make you capable of love, growth, and authentic connection, your ability to empathize, your willingness to be vulnerable, your commitment to working through difficulties, become weapons that these 6 types of people use against you, often without conscious awareness of what they're doing. They are not deliberately trying to harm you, but their cognitive structures are designed to extract what they need from others without providing reciprocal value, and the inevitable result is the gradual erosion of your own psychological health. The research files from Piaget's laboratory contain hundreds of cases documenting what happens to the supporters, friends, family members, and romantic partners of these 6 types of people. The pattern is remarkably consistent across different relationships and circumstances. Initially, the supporter feels energized by the opportunity to help, gratified by signs of appreciation and apparent progress, hopeful that their love and patience will eventually facilitate genuine change. But as months and years pass without real growth, as the same problems resurface regardless of how much support has been provided, as the supported person's demands increase while their appreciation decreases, the supporter begins experiencing symptoms of what Piaget termed cognitive exhaustion. This exhaustion manifests as difficulty concentrating on their own goals and interests, decreased ability to maintain other relationships, chronic anxiety about the supported person's well-being, and a gradual loss of trust in their own perceptions and judgments. The supporter begins to question whether they're doing enough, whether they're being too harsh when they feel frustrated, whether they should try a different approach, whether the lack of progress is somehow their fault. They lose touch with their own needs and boundaries because all their mental and emotional energy becomes focused on analyzing and responding to the other person's dysfunction. This erosion of self-trust becomes particularly devastating because it mirrors exactly what Piaget observed in children who were constantly corrected or rescued before they could develop their own problem-solving schemas. The child who never gets to struggle with a puzzle because someone immediately shows them the solution never develops the confidence that comes from figuring things out independently. Similarly, the person who chronically tries to save others never gets to experience the satisfaction and growth that comes from focusing on their own development and allowing others to face their natural consequences. They become stuck in what Piaget would recognize as a form of cognitive regression, where their thinking becomes increasingly dependent on external validation and decreasingly capable of independent judgment. The 6th and final type represents perhaps the most complex challenge because it involves people who have become addicted to the rescue dynamic itself. These individuals have learned to create crises specifically to attract helpers, and they've become skilled at identifying and targeting people with strong caregiving instincts. Piaget's work with children who exhibited what he called learned helplessness provides crucial insight into this pattern. He observed that some children, when consistently rescued from minor challenges, would begin to manufacture increasingly dramatic problems to maintain the attention and intervention they had grown accustomed to receiving. The child who discovers that falling down dramatically brings immediate comfort and assistance might begin to fall more frequently and more theatrically, even when perfectly capable of walking steadily. In adult relationships, this dynamic becomes exponentially more complex and destructive. The person addicted to rescue creates situations that seem to require intervention, while simultaneously sabotaging any genuine help that might lead to actual independence. They've learned to present their problems in ways that trigger the helper's psychological vulnerabilities, often cycling through multiple helpers as each one eventually becomes exhausted or wise to the pattern. They become expert at finding new people who haven't yet learned to recognize the difference between someone who needs temporary support during a genuine crisis and someone who has structured their entire identity around being perpetually in need of rescue. What makes this type particularly challenging is that their need for rescue has become so deeply embedded in their cognitive schemas that any genuine progress toward independence feels threatening to their core sense of self. Piaget understood that changing deeply established cognitive patterns requires not just new information, but a fundamental reorganization of how a person processes and responds to their environment. For someone whose entire social and emotional world revolves around being rescued, the prospect of becoming genuinely self-sufficient can feel like psychological death. They unconsciously resist real help while demanding symbolic help, creating an impossible situation for anyone who genuinely wants to support them. The tragedy for helpers caught in this dynamic is that their natural empathy and problem-solving skills, which serve them well in healthy relationships, become weapons used against them. The rescue-addicted person becomes highly skilled at identifying exactly what will motivate each particular helper to continue the dysfunctional dance. They learn to present their crises in ways that make the helper feel uniquely qualified to solve them, creating a false sense of being specially needed and appreciated. This manipulation often happens unconsciously, making it even more difficult to recognize and address. Piaget's research revealed that the most effective learning happens when individuals are allowed to encounter challenges that are within their capability to handle, but require genuine effort and problem solving. This principle applies equally to emotional and social development in adulthood. When we consistently rescue people from consequences they are capable of managing, we prevent them from developing the confidence and skills that come from successful struggle. More importantly, we prevent ourselves from developing the discernment and boundaries that come from learning to distinguish between someone who genuinely needs temporary support and someone who has made dysfunction their primary strategy for connecting with others. The path forward requires what Piaget called optimal frustration, the precise amount of challenge that promotes growth without causing overwhelming distress. For the chronic helper, this means learning to tolerate the discomfort of watching others struggle with problems they could easily solve, while recognizing that solving these problems would actually prevent rather than promote real growth. It means developing the wisdom to distinguish between cruelty and kindness, understanding that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow someone to experience the natural consequences of their choices. This shift requires a fundamental reorganization of how we think about helping and relationships. Instead of measuring our value by how much we can fix or rescue, we learn to measure it by how well we can support others in developing their own capabilities. Instead of feeling guilty when we don't intervene in every crisis, we feel proud when we maintain healthy boundaries that allow both ourselves and others to grow. Instead of being attracted to people who seem to need us desperately, we're attracted to people who want to grow alongside us in mutual respect and interdependence. The transformation that becomes possible when we stop trying to save these 6 types of people is profound and far-reaching. We discover energy and mental clarity we didn't know we had when our psychological resources are no longer constantly drained by futile rescue attempts. We develop relationships characterized by genuine reciprocity rather than one-sided caretaking. We learn to trust our own perceptions and judgments instead of constantly second-guessing ourselves in response to manipulation or emotional volatility. We experience the deep satisfaction that comes from our own continued growth and development, rather than the exhausting cycle of temporary wins followed by inevitable disappointments that characterizes rescue relationships. Perhaps most importantly, we learn to distinguish between compassion and codependence, between genuine love and dysfunctional attachment. Piaget understood that real love requires respect for the other person's autonomy and capacity for growth, even when that growth involves struggle and temporary setbacks. When we stop trying to save people who don't want to be saved, we create space for relationships with people who are genuinely committed to their own development and capable of supporting ours in return. The wisdom Piaget offers us isn't about becoming cold or uncaring. It's about becoming discerning and effective in our caring. It's about understanding that the highest form of respect we can show another human being is to believe in their capability to handle their own challenges and grow from their own experiences. It's about recognizing that our desire to help, while often genuinely motivated by love, can become a form of control when it prevents others from developing their own strengths and resilience. When you think about the people in your life who have truly supported your growth, they probably weren't the ones who solved all your problems for you. They were the ones who believed in your ability to figure things out, who offered guidance when you asked for it, but didn't insist on taking over your struggles, who celebrated your victories because they knew you had earned them through your own effort and determination. This is the kind of support that truly honors both the helper and the person being helped. And it's only possible when we learn to recognize and step away from relationships that demand us to be rescuers rather than companions on the journey of growth. Your recognition of these patterns in your own life doesn't make you selfish or uncaring. It makes you wise. It means you're ready to engage in relationships that bring out the best in everyone involved, rather than relationships that drain your energy while enabling dysfunction in others. The peace and clarity that comes from this shift creates space for connections based on mutual growth, respect, and genuine care, rather than crisis, drama, and endless rescue attempts. You know, sharing this journey of recognition and transformation doesn't have to be something you navigate alone. There's something powerful about knowing that others are asking the same questions, making the same difficult but necessary changes, and discovering the freedom that comes from healthy boundaries and conscious relationships. If these insights about Piaget's approach to human development resonate with you, consider joining our community of people who are committed to growth without drama, connection without codependence, and relationships that honor everyone's capacity for positive change. We explore these themes every week, diving deep into the psychological principles that can transform how we connect with others and how we show up in the world. The button below isn't just a subscription to a channel, it's an invitation to continue this conversation with people who understand that real love sometimes means stepping back so others can step up. Your next discovery about healthy relationships might be exactly what helps you create the life and connections you've been seeking. And it starts with that simple click below. And if this exploration of who not to save has opened up questions about who and how we should support in healthy ways, you'll want to watch our next video about the 4 signs someone is genuinely ready for growth and how to support them without falling into rescue patterns. These signs are subtle but unmistakable once you know what to look for, and recognizing them can transform your ability to build relationships that are truly mutual and growth-promoting for everyone involved.